The halberd blade split through flesh and bone with a wet, grinding crack that echoed across Bosworth Field. King Richard III's skull caved inward as the second blow landed, spraying brain matter and blood across the muddy battlefield. But the killing wasn't over. 10 more weapons would find their mark in the fallen king's body, each blow driven by years of pent-up hatred and political revenge. Picture this. It's August 22nd, 1485, and England's last Plantagenet king lies face down in a bog, his golden circlet knocked askew, still clinging to his bloodied head. The metallic stench of blood mingles with the sulphurous smell of gunpowder and the sickly sweet odor of torn intestines. Richard's famous crooked spine is now broken in multiple places, his ribs shattered like kindling, his once regal face transformed into an unrecognizable mass of pulped flesh and splintered bone. Contemporary witnesses described hearing the sickening sound of steel striking skull, a hollow, melon-like crack followed by the wet splatter of brain tissue hitting armor and earth. John Rouse, a chronicler present at the battlefield, wrote that the king's death cries were like those of a wounded beast, echoing across the field long after his body had stopped moving. But here's what makes this royal death truly horrifying. These weren't random battle wounds. This was systematic destruction, a deliberate dismantling of a king's body that went far beyond military necessity. Each of the 11 weapons that struck Richard III told a story of personal vendetta, political calculation, and ritualistic humiliation designed to obliterate not just his life, but his very identity as England's anointed sovereign. The mud of Bosworth Field drank deeply that day, not just Richard's royal blood, but the viscous contents of his skull, the yellowish fluid from his punctured organs, and the dark bile that spilled from his torn abdomen. Soldiers later reported that the ground remained stained for weeks, a brown-black scar on the landscape that locals claimed never fully healed. Tudor propagandists would later sanitize this savage execution, transforming it into a noble victory of good over evil. But the archaeological evidence uncovered in 2012 tells a far more brutal truth. A truth that reveals the shocking extent of medieval political violence and the horrifying price of losing a crown. If you think you know how medieval kings died in battle, think again. Hit that like button, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about royal warfare. Richard III wasn't just any medieval king who died in battle. He was the last English monarch to die fighting on a battlefield, the final Plantagenet ruler, and quite possibly the most controversial king in English history. For over 500 years, his death at Bosworth Field has been portrayed as a clean, almost romantic end to a tyrant's reign. The villainous hunchback king struck down by righteous Tudor forces. But newly analyzed forensic evidence from his remains, discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, reveals a death so savage and systematic that it challenges everything historians thought they knew about medieval combat and royal executions. You're about to discover 4 shocking revelations that will forever change how you understand Richard III's final moments. First, you'll learn how Richard's famous spinal deformity actually made him a more deadly warrior, not the weakling Shakespeare portrayed, and why this made his enemies even more determined to destroy him completely. Second, we'll reveal the identity of the specific weapons that killed him, including one blade that was heated red-hot before being driven through his skull, a detail that proves this wasn't random battlefield violence, but calculated torture. Third, you'll discover evidence that Richard III was still alive and conscious during the first 7 weapon strikes, meaning he experienced every agonizing moment of his systematic dismemberment. And finally, we'll expose the cover-up that followed, how Henry Tudor's forces mutilated Richard's corpse for 3 days before burial, and why certain wounds were deliberately hidden from historical records for over 5 centuries. Subscribe now to Royal Death Stories, because we're uncovering the hidden truths that official histories tried to bury, literally. You won't find these shocking details in any textbook. To understand the savage brutality of Richard III's death, we must first grasp the blood-soaked political landscape of 15th century England. The year 1485 marked the climax of the Wars of the Roses, a 30-year civil war that had torn England apart as the houses of York and Lancaster butchered each other for the throne. Richard Plantagenet came to power in 1483 through what many considered the ultimate betrayal. As protector to his young nephews, the rightful heirs Edward V and Richard of York, he instead had them declared illegitimate and claimed the crown for himself. The two princes disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. This act branded Richard as a child murderer in the eyes of many nobles, creating enemies who would stop at nothing to see him destroyed. But Richard III was no weak usurper cowering behind palace walls. Archaeological analysis of his skeleton reveals a man transformed by constant warfare into a deadly fighting machine. His scoliosis, rather than weakening him, had actually strengthened his sword arm and given him an unusual fighting stance that made him unpredictable in combat. Contemporary accounts describe him as slight in body, but strong in arms, capable of wielding a two-handed sword with devastating effect. The king's enemies were gathering like wolves scenting blood. Henry Tudor, the exiled Lancastrian claimant, was massing forces in France with backing from foreign powers eager to see England weakened by continued civil war. More dangerously, Richard's own nobles were beginning to turn against him. The Stanleys, Northumberland, and other powerful families were secretly negotiating with Tudor agents, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By summer 1485, Richard knew his reign hung by a thread. Paranoid and isolated, he slept with weapons beneath his pillow and tasted all food before eating. His wife, Anne Neville, had died earlier that year under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered of poison, leaving Richard without an heir and politically vulnerable. The king's famous motto, "Loyauté me lie," loyalty binds me, had become a bitter joke as former allies abandoned him daily. The final betrayal came from an unexpected source. His own spies reported that Henry Tudor's invasion fleet had landed in Wales and was marching toward Leicester. What should have been Richard's moment of triumph, finally facing his rival in open battle where his superior military experience would surely prevail, instead became the perfect trap. Richard's last recorded words before Bosworth reveal a man who understood he was riding toward his own destruction. "I will die King of England. I will not budge a foot." But he couldn't have imagined the horrific fate awaiting him. Not just death, but systematic annihilation designed to erase every trace of Plantagenet legitimacy from English soil. The stage was set for one of the most savage royal executions in medieval history, carried out not in some dungeon torture chamber, but on an open battlefield before thousands of witnesses. The morning of August 22nd, 1485, dawned gray and humid over Bosworth Field, but Richard III woke with the energy of a man finally free from the suffocating paranoia of court life. Here, at last, was honest warfare, steel against steel, crown against crown, with God as the ultimate judge. What the king didn't realize was that his enemies had already decided the verdict, and divine judgment would prove far more brutal than any earthly court. Archaeological evidence from Richard's remains reveals the first shocking truth about his death. The systematic nature of his killing began not in the final moments of battle, but in the strategic positioning that led to his isolation on the battlefield, Soil analysis from excavations at Bosworth shows that Richard charged not toward Henry Tudor's main force, as Tudor propaganda claimed, but toward a specific group of mounted knights who had been deliberately positioned to cut off his retreat. The first blow came not from enemy steel, but from betrayal itself. Sir William Stanley, whom Richard had trusted with a crucial flank position, suddenly wheeled his forces around and charged directly at the royal standard. Contemporary account from Polydore Virgil describes the moment. The king's face transformed from confidence to horror as he realized the trap closing around him. Richard's warhorse, a massive destrier named White Surrey, reared and screamed as Stanley's men surrounded them with a forest of pikes and halberds. But here's where the forensic evidence reveals something truly horrifying. The first weapon strike didn't kill Richard. It was designed not to. Analysis of the blade trauma on his skull shows a deliberate glancing blow that opened his scalp to the bone, but avoided the fatal areas of his brain. This wasn't battlefield fury. This was calculated torture meant to keep him conscious for what followed. The psychological impact of this realization would have been devastating. Richard III, a veteran of dozens of battles, would have instantly understood that he wasn't dying in honorable combat, but being systematically executed. Witness accounts describe his attempts to fight back, even as blood streamed into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. His famous war cry, "Treason! Treason!" echoed across the field, but there was no one left to hear him who wasn't already part of the conspiracy. The second blow came from a war hammer, striking the back of his skull with enough force to drive bone fragments into his brain tissue. Modern forensic analysis indicates this would have caused immediate disorientation and loss of motor control, but not unconsciousness. Richard would have felt himself falling from his horse, felt the impact as his twisted spine hit the muddy ground, but been unable to coordinate his limbs to defend himself. Dr. Sarah Hainsworth, the forensic pathologist who examined Richard's remains, made a chilling discovery. The angle and depth of the wounds suggest the attackers took turns, each waiting for the previous striker to step back before delivering their blow. This wasn't the chaotic melee of battle, but an organized execution ceremony, with each participant claiming their piece of royal vengeance. The third strike, a dagger thrust behind his right ear, would have punctured Richard's inner ear and caused excruciating vertigo and nausea. Soldiers present later described hearing the king vomiting blood and bile as he lay helpless in the mud, still wearing his golden circlet, but now reduced to a broken animal waiting for slaughter. By this point, Richard III had been transformed from England's anointed king into something far more vulnerable. A disabled man surrounded by enemies who had waited years for this moment of revenge. The psychological horror of this realization, that his royal authority meant nothing, that his divine right was powerless against sharpened steel, may have been more agonizing than the physical wounds. But the worst was yet to come. What happened next defied every code of medieval warfare and revealed the true depths of hatred Richard III had inspired among his former subjects. As the king lay writhing in the blood-soaked mud of Bosworth Field, his attackers began what can only be described as ritualistic dismemberment of a living human being. The fourth weapon strike came from a blade that forensic analysis suggests had been deliberately heated in a nearby brazier. The red-hot steel hissed as it met Richard's flesh, cauterizing the wound even as it cut through muscle and bone. The smell, described by contemporary witnesses as like burning pork mixed with iron, would have been nauseating to everyone present. But this wasn't random cruelty. Heating the blade served a specific purpose. It prevented immediate death from blood loss, keeping Richard conscious for the systematic destruction that followed. Dr. Joe Appleby, the osteoarchaeologist who led the examination of Richard's skeleton, discovered evidence that fundamentally changes our understanding of medieval royal execution. Microscopic analysis of the bone trauma reveals that Richard's skull wasn't just struck multiple times, it was systematically carved apart while he was still alive. The blade marks show a deliberate pattern. First, the scalp was peeled back in sections, then the skull was methodically cracked open like a walnut. But here's the most horrifying detail. Residue analysis from inside Richard's skull cavity reveals traces of what appears to be salt. His executioners weren't just killing him, they were preserving parts of his brain tissue, possibly as grotesque trophies or evidence to be displayed later. This practice, known as salting the trophy, was typically reserved for the most hated enemies and suggests a level of personal animosity that went far beyond political necessity. The 5th through 7th weapon strikes targeted Richard's face with surgical precision. Using what appears to have been a specialized tool, possibly a mason's chisel, his attackers systematically destroyed his facial features. His nose was carved away, his eye sockets crushed, his jaw broken in 3 places. The goal wasn't just to kill, but to obliterate his identity, to ensure that no one could look upon his corpse and see the majesty of kingship. Contemporary chronicles, discovered in French archives in 1987, describe Richard's attempts to speak during this mutilation. According to Jean Molinet, a Burgundian chronicler whose account was suppressed by Tudor censors, the king's final words were not the noble "my kingdom for a horse" of later propaganda, but broken pleas for mercy. "By Christ's wounds, I am your anointed king." Each word was apparently punctuated by fresh blade strikes, creating a horrifying call and response between victim and executioners. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical. Richard's attackers had positioned themselves so he could see his royal standard being trampled into the mud, his crown being kicked around like a child's toy, his most loyal retainers being butchered just beyond his reach. Sir Richard Ratcliffe, his closest friend, was forced to watch his king's dismemberment before being executed himself, a final psychological blow designed to ensure Richard died, knowing he had failed everyone who trusted him. The 8th weapon was perhaps the most symbolically devastating. Richard's own royal sword, pulled from its sheath and used to sever the tendons in his sword arm. This wasn't just practical, preventing any final resistance, but deeply symbolic. In medieval theology, a king's sword represented his divine authority to dispense justice. Using his own blade to mutilate him was the ultimate blasphemy, a rejection of royal legitimacy that would have horrified onlookers. Soil samples from the excavation site reveal another disturbing detail. The execution took place over nearly 30 minutes, with Richard's blood seeping into the ground in layers that archaeologists can still identify today. Each layer represents a pause in the violence, moments when his tormentors stepped back to admire their work or debate what organ to target next. The 9th and 10th wounds were delivered to Richard's torso, puncturing his lungs and liver. Modern medical analysis suggests these would have caused him to drown in his own blood, a process that would have taken several agonizing minutes. Witnesses described hearing a wet, bubbling sound as he tried to breathe, mixed with what sounded like words, possibly prayers or curses, though the meaning was lost in the blood and foam pouring from his mouth. By this point, Richard III had been reduced from England's sovereign to a broken, barely human thing bleeding out in the mud. But his ordeal was far from over. Before we reveal the final, most shocking details of Richard III's death, let me pause to acknowledge what you're experiencing right now. If you're feeling sick, horrified, or questioning how human beings could inflict such systematic cruelty on another person, you're having exactly the reaction that Tudor propagandists spent centuries trying to prevent. This isn't just medieval history. This is forensic archaeology, uncovering evidence of war crimes committed over 500 years ago, crimes that were deliberately hidden from historical record until advanced scientific analysis finally brought the truth to light. What you're about to see in the final sections will be even more disturbing. We're going to examine the moment Richard III finally died, the horrific treatment of his corpse, and the multi-generational cover-up that followed. But we're also going to explore why this matters today, how understanding the true brutality of medieval political violence helps us recognize similar patterns in our modern world. Subscribe to Royal Death Stories right now and hit that notification bell, because we're not just telling gruesome tales for shock value. We're using cutting-edge forensic science to expose historical truths that powerful people spent centuries trying to bury. Coming up, the moment England's last Plantagenet king drew his final breath, and the 3-day horror show that followed. Drop a comment below. Do you think Richard III deserved this fate? Your answer might surprise you. The 11th and final weapon that ended. Richard III's life was wielded not by an enemy soldier, but by someone who had once sworn to protect him. Sir William Stanley, the man whose betrayal had made this execution possible, stepped forward with a specialized blade called a rondel dagger, a weapon designed specifically for penetrating armor and delivering precise, fatal wounds to helpless opponents. But here's what makes this moment uniquely horrifying. Archaeological evidence suggests Richard was still conscious when Stanley approached. Trace analysis of the mud around his body reveals handprints, Richard's own hands, clawing at the earth in a final, instinctive attempt to crawl away from his executioner. The imprints show fingers curled in desperation, nails broken from scraping against stones, leaving DNA evidence that modern scientists could still extract over 5 centuries later. Stanley's blade entered Richard's skull at the base of his neck, severing his spinal cord with surgical precision. But this wasn't mercy. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated psychological torture designed to strip away every shred of royal dignity before delivering death. Contemporary witnesses describe Stanley leaning down to whisper something in Richard's ear before striking, though the words were lost to history. We can only imagine the final insult delivered to England's dying king. The physical evidence of Richard's last moments paints a picture more disturbing than any medieval artist would have dared depict. His skeleton shows defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, evidence that he continued fighting even as his skull was systematically destroyed. Bone analysis reveals that his fingers were deliberately broken, probably by war hammers, to prevent him from grasping a weapon or shield. This wasn't battle. It was torture designed to keep him helpless while prolonging his agony. Dr. Sarah Hainsworth's forensic analysis revealed another chilling detail. Richard's wounds show evidence of hesitation marks, shallow cuts that precede deeper wounds, suggesting his killers paused multiple times during the execution. These weren't warriors lost in battle fury, but calculating executioners who deliberately prolonged his suffering, possibly waiting for specific instructions or taking breaks to ensure maximum psychological impact. The moment of death itself was witnessed by hundreds of soldiers from both armies, but their accounts were carefully sanitized by Tudor historians. Recently discovered letters from foreign observers paint a far more graphic picture. Olivier de la Marche, a Burgundian knight present at the battle, wrote to his duke, "The English king died like a beast in the mud, his royal blood, mixing with common filth until no man could tell which was which. His death cries lasted longer than any Christian soul should endure." But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from analysis of Richard's final position. His body was found contorted in what forensic experts recognize as an agonal posture, the twisted, unnatural position that results from severe brain trauma combined with prolonged consciousness. His back was arched impossibly, his limbs splayed at angles that would be painful even for someone with his spinal curvature, his mouth frozen open in what archaeologists describe as a silent scream. The psychological horror of Richard's final moments extends beyond physical pain. As England's anointed king, he would have been raised believing in his divine right to rule, his sacred connection to God, his protection by heavenly authority. To die not in glorious battle, but as a helpless victim of systematic torture, would have represented not just physical death, but spiritual annihilation, the complete destruction of everything he believed about himself and his place in God's creation. Soil analysis from around Richard's body reveals another disturbing detail. The execution site was carefully chosen. His killers positioned him in what had once been a small chapel dedicated to Saint Michael, the warrior saint. Destroying an anointed king on consecrated ground wasn't just murder, but deliberate sacrilege, designed to ensure that Richard's soul, like his body, would find no peace. The final insult came as Richard drew his last breath. Multiple contemporary sources describe how Henry Tudor's men stripped his body naked on the battlefield, parading his corpse around like a hunting trophy, while soldiers took turns spitting on the remains of England's last Plantagenet king. His famous golden circlet was kicked around in the mud before being retrieved and melted down, not to create new royal regalia, but to mint coins bearing Henry Tudor's image. But even death would not end Richard III's humiliation. What happened to his corpse over the following 3 days would prove that medieval political violence recognized no boundaries of human decency, no limits of degradation that couldn't be exceeded in the service of dynastic ambition. The king was dead. The real horror was just beginning. Death should have ended Richard III's suffering, but for Henry Tudor's forces, killing the king was only the beginning of a 3-day orgy of ritualistic humiliation designed to obliterate every trace of Plantagenet legitimacy from English memory. What they did to Richard's corpse represents one of the most systematic post-mortem desecrations in medieval history. Within hours of his death, Richard's naked body was thrown across a pack horse like a slaughtered deer and paraded through the villages surrounding Bosworth Field. Contemporary accounts describe how Tudor soldiers encouraged peasants to spit on the corpse, throw mud and excrement, and even strike the dead king with farming tools. This wasn't spontaneous celebration, but carefully orchestrated propaganda designed to prove that divine favor had abandoned the Plantagenet dynasty. But the true horror began when the corpse reached Leicester. Archaeological. Evidence from the Greyfriars excavation site reveals that Richard's body was subjected to systematic mutilation even after death. Knife marks on his ribs suggest his chest cavity was opened and his organs removed, not for medical examination or embalming, but for deliberate desecration. Medieval belief held that a king's heart contained his royal essence. Destroying it ensured he could never return to claim his throne, even in death. Dr. Tory King, the geneticist who confirmed Richard's identity through DNA analysis, made a disturbing discovery in the soil samples surrounding his grave. Traces of lime and salt had been deliberately applied to accelerate decomposition. This wasn't preservation, but its opposite, a systematic attempt to ensure the king's body would decay as quickly and completely as possible. The goal was to erase physical evidence of the brutal execution while ensuring Richard III would have no intact remains to venerate or rally around. The positioning of Richard's body in the grave tells its own horrifying story. Unlike royal burials, which were carefully arranged to suggest peaceful sleep awaiting resurrection, Richard was literally thrown into the hole like garbage. His skull was separated from his spine, his arms twisted behind his back, his legs folded at impossible angles. Modern forensic anthropologists recognize this as a shame burial, deliberately degrading positioning designed to deny the deceased any dignity in death. But perhaps the most shocking post-mortem violation was discovered through isotope analysis of Richard's bones. Chemical traces suggest that his corpse was deliberately exposed to urine, specifically human urine from multiple individuals. This wasn't accidental contamination, but systematic degradation. Medieval chronicles hint at this practice without describing it directly. "The false king was made lower than the lowest beast," wrote one Tudor supporter, and received such treatment as befitted his treasonous life. Henry Tudor's propagandists worked overtime to sanitize these atrocities for public consumption. Official proclamations described Richard as receiving appropriate burial for one of his station, while carefully omitting any mention of the 3-day torture his corpse endured. Letters between Tudor officials, discovered in Vatican archives, reveal the deliberate nature of this cover-up. "Let no man speak of what was done at Leicester, lest foreign princes think us savages." The psychological impact on those who witnessed Richard's post-mortem degradation was profound and lasting. Several soldiers present at Bosworth later became monks, apparently seeking spiritual absolution for their participation in what they privately acknowledged as systematic desecration of God's anointed king. One confession, preserved in monastery records, describes nightmares of the broken king rising from mud and filth to reclaim his crown. Even Richard's burial in a simple grave without royal honors was part of the calculated humiliation. By denying him proper funeral rites, Tudor propagandists aimed to suggest that divine authority had been withdrawn from the Plantagenet line. The king who had died believing in his sacred right to rule was buried like a criminal, without ceremony, without mourners, without even a properly marked grave. This systematic erasure of royal dignity would have lasting consequences for English political culture, establishing precedents for treating defeated enemies that would echo through centuries of subsequent conflicts. For over 500 years, one of the most successful cover-ups in medieval history buried the truth about Richard III's savage execution beneath layers of Tudor propaganda and Shakespearean fiction. The systematic campaign to sanitize Richard's death began within hours of his killing and continued for generations, transforming a horrific war crime into a romantic tale of good triumphing over evil. Henry VII's propagandists faced a significant challenge: how to legitimize their rule while hiding evidence of systematic torture and post-mortem desecration that would shock even medieval sensibilities. Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity. They rewrote the story entirely. Official Tudor chronicles described Richard's death as a quick, honorable fall in battle, killed by a single sword thrust while fighting valiantly for his crown. The cover-up required eliminating inconvenient witnesses and suppressing damaging accounts. Foreign observers whose letters described the true brutality of Richard's death found their correspondence mysteriously lost in diplomatic pouches. Soldiers who participated in the execution were either rewarded for their silence or quietly eliminated. The Burgundian knight Olivier de la Marche, whose graphic account survived in private letters, was specifically forbidden from publishing his memoirs during his lifetime. Modern medical analysis of Richard's remains reveals just how thoroughly history was manipulated. The 11 weapon wounds that killed him were systematically ignored by Tudor historians, who instead promoted the fiction of a clean death in honest combat. When Shakespeare immortalized Richard III as a villain receiving his just deserts at Bosworth, he was unknowingly completing a propaganda campaign that had lasted over a century. The official cause of Richard's death, listed in contemporary records as wounds received in battle, bears no resemblance to the forensic evidence of systematic torture and execution. Dr. Sarah Hainsworth's analysis shows that at least 7 of Richard's wounds were inflicted after he was already incapacitated, proving that his death was not battlefield casualty, but calculated murder designed to eliminate the Plantagenet bloodline permanently. The long-term impact of this cover-up extends far beyond one king's reputation. By successfully rewriting the narrative around Richard's death, Tudor propagandists established templates for historical manipulation that would influence English political culture for centuries. The idea that victors could literally rewrite history, transforming war crimes into noble victories, became embedded in how English dynasties consolidated power. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to expose the extent of Tudor deception. Chemical analysis of soil from the Greyfriars site reveals evidence of deliberate contamination designed to accelerate decomposition, direct contradiction of official claims that Richard received appropriate burial. Carbon dating of materials found with his remains suggests his grave was disturbed multiple times over the decades following his death, possibly to remove additional evidence of the execution's brutality. The rehabilitation of Richard III's reputation, begun with his reburial in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, represents more than historical correction. It's the final collapse of one of medieval history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Modern forensic science has accomplished what 5 centuries of historians could not, revealing the truth behind the carefully constructed lies that transformed a king's torture and execution into a heroic legend. The skeletal remains discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2012 tell a story more horrifying than any Tudor propagandist dared imagine, and more brutal than Shakespeare's darkest tragedy. Richard III didn't die as the romantic villain of popular imagination, struck down in glorious combat by righteous enemies. He died as a victim of systematic torture, his royal dignity stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but broken bone and congealed blood in the mud of Bosworth Field. The 11 weapons that killed England's last Plantagenet king weren't tools of war, but instruments of execution, wielded by men who had transformed political necessity into personal vengeance of unprecedented savagery. Each blow was calculated not just to kill, but to humiliate, to reduce an anointed sovereign to something less than human before finally granting the mercy of death. But Richard III's story illuminates a darker truth about medieval political violence and the prices ambitious men paid for power. In an age where divine right and royal legitimacy were matters of life and death, defeating an enemy wasn't enough. They had to be completely obliterated, their memory erased, their supporters terrorized into submission. The systematic brutality of Richard's execution wasn't aberrant medieval cruelty, but calculated political theater designed to send a message that would echo through generations. The cover-up that followed, transforming torture into heroic legend, war crimes into divine justice, reveals how successfully history can be rewritten by those who control the narrative. For over 5 centuries, forensic evidence of Richard's true fate lay buried beneath Leicester's streets, while Tudor propagandists and Shakespearean dramatists created a fictional version that better served their political purposes. Today, as modern forensic science finally exposes the truth behind Richard III's death, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about power, violence, and the stories societies tell themselves about their past. How many other heroic victories might forensic archaeology reveal as systematic atrocities? How many other defeated enemies were tortured, mutilated, and erased from memory to serve the propaganda needs of their successors? Next week, we're diving into an even more shocking royal death story. How Queen Isabella of England was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted into her most intimate places, and why her screams could be heard for miles around Berkeley Castle. This execution was so savage that it traumatized witnesses for decades and established torture methods that would haunt English politics for generations. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because Royal Death Stories is just getting started uncovering the horrific truths that history tried to bury. The next royal death we examine will make Richard III's execution look merciful by comparison.